this kickoff for the year, we maxed out at 100 participants, and I think we've got 26 states represented, which is fabulous, and people from single site owners to multi-site owners. We've got some of our national groups here and a couple of our private equity investors as well. So thanks a lot, and I really hope that you guys will take advantage of the last 20 minutes or so, and we do questions and comments, because all I'm here to do is really share what you guys say to us. I'm not going to share any brilliant information that I made up. So we just talk to people all day long and share what we hear with everyone else. And if you're like us, there are very few places in our industry to go for that type of information. I will say that the recent article in Childcare Information Exchange that comes out in their January-February issue is pretty good. They did a survey on what the main issues were. We hear, I'll tell you what that was, but we hear a couple of things a bit differently, so we'll talk about that too. But it's always good information about who the players are, what they've done during the year, and where they expect the industry to go in the next year. So that's what we hope to do today. What we'll talk about is changes in business operations as we hear it from our clients, things that we thought were noteworthy in 16. We'll talk about the things that happened to our knowledge in the buying and selling world in 2016, and also talk about what we expect to see in 2017. I'll recap what I said this time last year about 16 and see how well we did there. A little housekeeping before we get started. You should be able to see me. You should have our slides that start with update on the industry. Carrie emailed those out in handout form, so you should have that either in handout or on the screen or both. The webinar will be posted on our website within a couple of days, and so feel free to download and watch again or pass that along to others if you think it would be useful. Also on your panel bar is a questions tab. Feel free as I'm talking to give questions. Carrie will monitor and shoot the ones over to me that should be relevant to what I'm talking about right then. And then also, again, at the end, we'll save time for 15 or 20 minutes for questions or comments from you guys, which would be appreciated, and then get you back to work. So we appreciate you joining us on your lunch hour. Apologies for the reschedule date, and thank you for being with us. So first of all, let's talk about what we saw in business operations during the year, what we heard from folks. So the first thing is that we continue to hear from more and more of our clients that they are being approached and or participating in early Head Start collaborations. About 10 years ago, we saw a real shift in Head Start reaching out to private companies for regular Head Start 3- and 4-year-old programs, where they would either mainstream students into existing classrooms, or in some cases they would contract with the private child care company to provide their Head Start program in their building to their specifications. Head Start funding over the last 20 years has been incredibly stable. This industry is great at following the money trail. And so if you have extra capacity, I think it's a great way to reach out to your local Head Start agency where those relationships are made and decisions are made, and see if they have the need for more space or to place children in other programs. What we've heard in the last couple of years is a bigger outreach for early Head Start funding, which is for children up to age 3. And have not seen any mainstream situations, but I have seen many situations where they will contract the private provider to provide a certain classroom. And they're funding for equipment and resources. I've seen them do some beautiful playgrounds for these private providers. And again, it's a great source of revenue for excess space. So continue to see that federal funding mixed with private companies, and that's exciting. The second thing I'd like to mention is I think this is the second year in a row, I mentioned this also last year, that we see providers more confident about increasing their tuition rates. There was such a, and probably rightly so, a fear from 2009 to 12 about excuse me, about tuition rates and about keeping those manageable for parents as the economy was recovering. But then we got in that role and we either forgot or we just were fearful of getting the rates back up where they needed to be. And we're always out there preaching that, because at the same time, we're going to talk about how difficult staffing is, and your costs are increasing, and you really need to be sure that that happens regularly, annually. We did a webinar about 2 years ago, I think, about tuition rates, but not only tuition rates, but other charges and discounts that can affect your overall financial picture even more than increasing the tuition rate. So if that's something that you'd like more information on, you pick up that webinar from a couple of years ago. I think it's still very relevant. The third point here is that we're seeing companies expand into new markets. We're probably seeing more buying activity right now than, well, we always see selling activity, and it's definitely a seller's market. The pricing has continued to increase, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, how it looks for both business and real estate assets. But also we're seeing some of our, the national and large regional companies have long had aggressive growth plans. But what we're seeing a new surge in is smaller companies trying to build a new site or buy a new site. So a lot of our 3 to 10 site companies are now wanting to grow, and that's been exciting. So there's been a good bit of activity around that in the last year. Some companies are launching new brands. A couple of the national groups have started new brands. They're typically in higher end areas, some STEM programs, and they are doing new construction mainly. So we're seeing a real surge in, and not just with new brands, we're seeing a surge in new construction for the larger groups, and also in a couple of new brands that they've put out there. In addition to Headstart, subsidy seems to remain stable. I'm going to say on the one hand that a lot of our buyers, so this is an opportunity for smaller companies to grow. A lot of our larger buyers, and I've got this on another point that's coming up, like to stay away from subsidy situations. The logic is that subsidy might be a single payer, and if there's an issue with that funding, then a lot of money goes away. Over time, it's been very stable, though, as a revenue source, so I'm not, personally, don't feel like it's quite as volatile as some do. And so if you, as a buyer, are willing to accept some level of subsidy, then that's a real advantage. And most people believe that if you get in food program range up to about 30% subsidy or so, you can hold a healthy culture mix there. Once you go too much over about 50%, you'll go to almost 100% subsidy. And that does get a little scary if there are some changes. And we typically, if we're going to see changes, they're on the state level. And the funding, if there's a blip there with payments or something happens there, then that can be a little scary for people that have predominant subsidy in their school. And then the last thing that I want to mention, and this is probably the #1 reason that we hear from people today that they want to possibly not be in the industry anymore as an owner. And I'm being very tactful here when I say struggles with staff culture. Basically what they say is that today's workforce is a bit difficult to work with in their expectations about their job, how they communicate, and how they work, and a bit about their work ethic. So the two things we hear are frustrations with regulation, and I think that will continue. And the second thing is frustrations with staff. So that's what we hear in business operations. Happy to take anybody else's thoughts if someone has one. So we will look out for that. Okay, let's talk a bit about the buying and selling patterns that we saw this last year. I always like to start with, because there have been so many in the past 2 years, and they have a true relevance on every size company. I like to start with the large transactions that were completed. If you guys are like me and you keep the Childcare Information Exchange Top 50 list, I'll just show you mine right here, that gets published every year in January, February. By the end of the year, I've typically got a lot of lines that roll up into the larger companies because there continues to be a good bit of demand for companies that have multiple sites. And so the larger companies, and you guys know that we're very fragmented, and if you start with the nation's largest company has 1,500 schools, if you get down to number 50 in size, they have 12. So there's a good bit of demand for those companies that are quality and have multiple sites in that mid-range. There were 2 larger transactions that were completed, and by larger I mean national companies that moved mainly from one equity group to another. It almost looks more like a financing change than a change in ownership, because typically the operations don't change. It would just move from one equity owner to another. There were 3 in 2015. There were 2 in 2016, Rainbow Childcare Centers out of Michigan, Detroit, sold to Quad C, a new equity company entering into the market, and then Cadence Education based in Phoenix, who was the former Phoenix Children's Academy, sold to Morgan Stanley, which was very interesting. Morgan Stanley was the former investor in Learning Care Group, the nation's second largest company that owns the brands La Petite, Child Time, Tutor Time, and Children's Courtyard. So 2 large transactions, and I mention those because they sort of set the bar for pricing in our industry. When those were continued the record high numbers that we saw from the 3 the year before, that gives everybody optimism about the industry, and it helps generate the enthusiasm that we see in the investment community wanting to come into our industry. When that happens, we all get stronger, so this is a good thing. The more of that we see, the more successful they are, the more interest there is in our industry. So those were the large transactions that happened during the year. The buyers of the world, I'll just mention real quickly, again, a lot of you guys are interested in either buying or growing by new site development. They're competitor companies who want and need to grow. If they're owned by investment groups, that's their game, so they have the need to grow, and they actively seek targets. And so if you are a smaller company and you're considering an acquisition of the same type of asset, there's a bit of competition for it. The things that would be most highly regarded are multiple site companies, companies that have single schools that gross over $1 million, all private pay in high-end markets, and no subsidy. So for smaller companies who are willing to compromise on one or more of those key features, there's some real opportunity out there in the growth market. Also, we continue to hear from new groups in the private equity community who want into the industry. I think that's getting more and more difficult because, as we said, typically they want a larger company to get started with. There aren't that many of them out there, and that's really difficult to do. So most of the activity flows through the larger companies that are buying smaller companies. And usually those are good transactions that go really well. The larger companies have great systems, people, and processes. They didn't get large without doing it well, and they can make the process easy, and typically are all cash buyers, so that all those things are very important to people when they get in a process. I put search funders on here because I mentioned this last year. My comment this year is we heard nothing this year, and could have just been that we didn't hear it from the search fund community. Search funders are individuals who are potentially being backed by equity providers to go out and find a company to buy and operate. So a little bit different than competitor companies who might want to fold someone into their existing structure, or private equity who want a platform company to get started. These guys actually want to operate a company. Could be that we didn't hear, we heard a lot about it in 15, nothing in 16. Could be that we didn't hear, it could be that they found out that it's a challenging industry to get into if you don't have a history in it. So that was an interesting change that we noted. Real estate, so where we saw by the end of the year, I think since about 2012, we felt like business values increased every year. We saw a real stability toward the end of 2016, which I think is comforting. I think it's good to know where your values should be and that they're sustainable. I think that it gets a little bit scary if we get over a price range that makes sense, even though if you're a seller, I know you want to be in that bucket at the right time, but if it's not sustainable, it's not good for people. It wouldn't be good for your staff or your, mute the microphone over there. Sorry. Got a little feedback, so I was just going to fix that real quick. Okay, quick check. Is it me that's doing the feedback? Okay, sorry. I don't know if you guys were hearing that, but I was hearing some loud feedback, so I thought it wasn't me. Again, toward the end of 2016, we saw the business values normalize to a place that we believe is sustainable and healthy for the industry. We are continuing, though, to see, and did toward the end of the year for 2016, we saw real estate values continue to rise. There are two main buckets of real estate buyers. If someone isn't buying it with their business, and of course those are individual buyers. I mentioned Reits here, which are real estate investment trusts. A real estate investment trust takes private money and invests it, just like a private equity company would in a business. They invest in real estate. And there are 6, 7, I think maybe this year, I think we picked up one new one, that mainly invest in our industry, that are doing a great job. They're really interesting to work with. Their processes are good. Their pricing's good. They typically want to go for larger companies. I think maybe the smallest one that we matched one up with was a 10-site group, so have to have a little size to get that institutional investment. But there's a good bit of competition for quality real estate with companies that are good providers, and so we saw those real estate values rise. We also are continuing to see individuals with money that they want to invest in real estate in our industry, and that pricing was going really well even toward the end of the year too. So maybe there's a little more room to grow there. I suspect most of us believe we're probably going to max out pretty soon. We should see interest rates rise, and probably we'll put a little bit of a hold. Maybe it won't decrease, but maybe it will stop the increase that we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years. But it's been really good, and we're excited about some of the real estate work that we've gotten done for some of our clients in the past couple of years. So let's talk about valuation. I probably mentioned some of this already. So what do we see happen in 2016 in valuation? When I say multiples, business values are based on a multiple of cash flow. We saw those stabilize, like I said. I think we have seen a slight creep up since about 2012, a little more competition. We are hearing some possible larger than average numbers for companies that might be platform companies, which need to be a little bit bigger and would put a new equity group into the market. But for most sellers, we believe that we've sort of hit a stable rate on the multiple for businesses that we can count on. When I say cap rates continue to decrease, basically this supports what I said earlier, that we continue to see real estate prices rise. Real estate prices are based on the capitalization rate that the investor wants. So if you think about it logically, if you're going to go buy a building and your interest rate is lower, then you can pay more for the property and keep your payment the same. So as the capitalization rate lowers, the real estate prices rise. So we, again, toward the end of the year, we saw those numbers go down. And who knows, we'll continue to watch that and see where that will go. I suspect we're probably at the tolerance level now, but we'll see. It would be great to think that would continue to happen in 2017. We are seeing greater caution among our buyers, and this is a good thing. So here comes the accountant in me out. Taking special care to verify the numbers that they're using to base a business and real estate value on. Not that they've not always been careful and done a good job with their diligence in looking at numbers, but a little more work going into that now. We work with our smaller buyers to help them through this process. The last thing you want to do is base an offer and then purchase a business based on numbers that you can't rely on. We try to minimize as many surprises as possible. We can't get rid of them all, but we try to work really hard to do that. So well, first of all, before I get into 17, let me tell you what we predicted for last year, and then let's see how that went. We talked last year about, I will mention a couple of things. So we did talk about the growth in franchising last year. That continues. Franchising is still the fastest growing segment of our industry, and those guys are going pretty strong with a lot of new development. Our forecast for 16 was that we would see continued investment in the industry. I think that happened, and that's exciting. For somebody like me who's been in it 30 years, it's just really exciting to see the institutional investment community love our industry and to find us a stable place to put their money. It's great for everyone. We predicted stable to increasing values. Again, I think we found the business values to be stable, and we found real estate values to increase. We predicted more new site development. None of this was, you know, us looking into a crystal ball. We were hearing these things from our clients, and we did see that, and we continue. I think we may see even more of that in 2017. And we saw a few new brands launched. So here's what we hear and sort of are on the lookout and expecting for 2017. The first thing is that we're just feeling a real confidence about and within our industry. So most of the companies are investing, so operational companies, both, you know, single sites all the way up to the national guys, and the people not in the industry who would like to be, are very excited about putting their money here. And that's good for us all, and it's good for the families that we serve and the children in our care. So I think that we will continue to see confidence in us as an industry. I think I talked enough about the subsidy, but just to sum that up, I think that we'll continue to see subsidy in The two main sources of revenue, which are the Child Development Block Grant, which is the federal money that flows through each state and is named something different and matched in some states. It's been very stable, and I think we'll continue to see that. I don't have any reason to think individual states will have a blip and back up on their funding, but every state's different, so that's just something that you really have to know and watch in your state if you participate in that. The USDA food program seems to be stable no matter what's going on in Washington and where we are. It just has been very stable over time and has been a good source of revenue for people who have a certain level of subsidy and can participate in that. So we expect those to remain stable. What we are seeing is that the buyers of the world really are shying away from that, like we mentioned before. So there's always been a mixed tolerance for acquiring schools with subsidy, especially at a high level. But even the companies that previously were okay with that are really trying to take a different strategy now. So that's both it's both a challenge for companies that operate with a lot of subsidy when they want to sell, but it's also an opportunity for the smaller companies who are okay playing in that market to acquire and at prices that they don't have so much competition for. So that's a real opportunity there for some. I think we'll continue to see new site development and growth. There's a surge in new schools across the country. We mentioned the franchise groups. They're growing quickly, and typically they construct a couple of those, attempted some acquisition in the last 5 years or so with very limited success, so they typically will construct. We always mention Children's Learning Adventure, which is the big box that is growing quickly in some communities in a big way. So they have been an interesting, different type of model that's been a factor in some markets. As far as, so I moved new administration changes to the bottom. I have it differently on my sheet because I thought that would be fun to talk about last. We expect business and real estate values to be stable and remain stable. Maybe a little more room to move upward for real estate. Stable business values that are solid, and again, I believe set companies up for success in the future. If you overpay for something, it's really hard to recover from. So that's probably the one thing that we see business owners make a mistake in when they grow. Either they overpay or overbuild on their real estate, or they overpay on an acquisition. Really hard to recover from that if that happens. So we work real hard to be sure that it's at a healthy level. And then possibly some increasing values for entry companies. But again, an entry company would be a probably 10 plus, maybe even 20 plus site company that would go to a new equity investor that wanted to get into the market. So let's talk about the new administration. That has been fast and furious, and I know your head's spinning just as much as I am. So I'm just going to repeat what I hear. I'll make no judgments about it. I'm just as confused as you are. I will say that overall, whether people agree with what's going on or not, I'm feeling a real optimism, even among people who are unhappy about the recent changes, unhappy about some of the things that have happened recently. From a business perspective, they usually end up saying we're pretty optimistic about what's going to happen in the business community. One of the things that gets mentioned is the Affordable Care Act. And I talk about this not from a cost perspective, because it did impact some companies from a cost perspective and in a major way, but that's not really the thing I hear from companies. The thing I hear from companies is that when they had to implement it, their staff, they felt were worse off than they were before. So they felt like that their staff had better coverage at better prices before they had to implement affordable care. So just what I hear. Their hope is that there will be more flexibility for people to do things that might make more sense for them with better coverage and less cost. not that they don't want to spend the money or have their employees covered, which makes me happy because we can never give enough to our teachers. They will never get paid enough or have enough benefits. The second thing is that there was the threat, especially in key states, about pretty large minimum wage increases. Those could still happen, but I think there's a little optimism that maybe those will be tempered a bit. And what happens really is that just gets passed along to parents, and it will put some parents out of the market, and that's a fear for some providers, that parents will go into situations that won't be healthy for their children. So going up drastically on minimum wage is a concern that I think people are feeling might not be quite as impactful with the new administration. There's just, I mentioned before, just a real hope for economic stability, regardless of whether anyone likes or agrees with what's going on. There appears to be a good bit of confidence in economic stability. There's a bit of new talk, and of course we just confirmed our new education secretary this week, but there is a good bit of talk about the possibility of increased private participation in our education system. There are some things that have been happening for years. Of course, charter schools are big in key states, especially Michigan and Arizona, and other states to varying degrees. We have childcare clients who also participate and operate charter schools. We have clients who operate after-school programs in the public schools. I really believe that this is a very under-noticed business opportunity. If your local school district has an after-school program and they outsource it, if they don't outsource it, maybe you can convince them that you would do a better job. But if they do outsource it, you have the right to bid for that program. It's a great collaboration. It's very financially successful, and I'm a big fan of that. So if you'd like more information about different models for that, we're happy to share that with you. We're seeing public schools, so Child Care Information Exchange noted as one of the major concerns, competition from the public schools. We don't hear this quite as much. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying we don't hear it as much from our clients. There are new public models of very early education. It seems to me like the ones that I've heard about are operated by this public schools. I'm not aware of any that private companies go in and operate, but love to know that if you guys know of some that I'm not aware of, because as or if they continue to do that, I think that would be a great collaboration as well if they have the facility, and more experienced operators in the private community can go in there. But there does seem to be a hope that under the new administration there will be more opportunity to participate in some of the federal funding that's allocated for education in whatever way that makes sense. So let's see. We have, so I talked really quickly, which is great because I think that you guys will have more to offer and probably have some great questions and ideas. We have our, I will mention while we're collecting questions here that our focus, we have an annual focus on our webinars. 2015 was an operational focus. You'll find things on accounts receivable, salary, cost control, tuition rate setting, and everything operational. Last year we had a real focus on either buying schools in real estate or selling, what the process is, how you value, what's important. And this year we're going to focus on real estate and how to use, and the main reason is just what I said earlier, that real estate is a very important asset in any company, and especially ours, and there's a lot of excitement right now around the values that we're seeing. So we're going to focus on everything related to how to use your real estate as an asset to grow, how to maintain your real estate, what types of investment you could expect in your real estate. So join us every other month during the year for something related to real estate, so we will put those out. Now, if you, again, if you go over to your question bar, it's over to your right, okay, so Carrie, I might need you to come over with your computer because I can see them here, but they're a little bit hard for me to read. How have valuations been trending over the past 3 or 4 years, and what is the general valuation multiple difference between large providers and smaller 1 to 5 unit providers? Really good question. This is so hard to answer. It's dependent on so many things. I'll give you some, but I will give you some ranges because it is an important question. Before I answer the number question about what the multiples are, I always like to say that the much more important question is what number are you basing that multiple on? So, okay, thank you. Another question. So we work really hard to be sure that the cash flow number or EBITDA number, EBITDA, which stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, which is just a big bunch of fancy words us accountants like to use to make us sound smart. It really just means cash flow. So how much cash can the business generate in a year after it gets sold? So some things might change even. So the amount that it generates today could be different. The new buyer might spend more in employee benefits. They might have to comply with affordable care where the seller didn't. Their rent might change. There are just a lot of factors that could impact the cash flow from the seller to the buyer. So that's the most important thing to think about. So once you get that number right, though, historically, so let's talk about smaller companies. Let's talk about single site companies first. Historically, because I'm doing this 30 years now, so until about 5 years ago, we were really a 3 to 5, don't panic, 3 to 5 multiple industry for a single site, meaning you would multiply the annual cash flow by somewhere between 3 and 5 times, and that would be your business value. When we talk about your business value, that includes your goodwill, the ongoing parent base, child base that generates the revenue, your equipment, your furniture and fixtures, any vehicles that generate the revenue. So any asset except your real estate, that's valued separately, that generates that revenue. We started to see a real creep up in that about 4 years ago. So I think the real average now is for solid companies is 4 to 5. I don't think we've done much under a 4 multiple in several years. There have been some transactions of troubled companies or companies that might not be in, they might be in a C market, or they might have a large level of subsidy and the buyer base was limited where they could go under a 4 multiple. But I think for single sites you could be in that, actually there's a little tighter range, 4 to 4 1/4, 4 1/2. When you get to 2 sites, it really does change the picture because it's just as much work to acquire 1 site as 2 once you have your systems and processes in place. So everyone would rather acquire multiple sites than 1. So that number really can creep up quickly. I'll say that in the last couple of years, we moved a 12-site group in the 5.5 multiple range and a 25-site group in the 7 multiple range. So those are good comps. Those don't happen that often, so it's kind of good to note. We hear, but this is unsubstantiated, so take this with a grain of salt. As you know, we have 1 publicly traded company in the industry, that's Sprite Horizons, great company, but completely different animal from the rest of us. They do mainly employer-sponsored care, and it's typically on a corporate site, so their expense structure is completely separately. You can get their numbers, but it's just hard to benchmark against it, is my point. But we understand that the large national companies, and these would all be more than 100 sites, traded between 10 and 12 as a multiple. So what you have is you've got single to 1 to 5 sites in the 4 to 5 multiple range. You've got 8 to 20 sites probably going in the 5 to 7 range. And then there were a couple of companies, but not many, a bit bigger than that, that might have gone in 8, and then you jump up to the national groups that go to 10. So you can see the benefit of the larger companies in acquiring and getting larger if they acquire at a lower multiple, and then they end up selling because they fold that company into their larger company at a larger multiple. That company gets more valuable for them pretty quickly. So that's the reason for the roll-up and the continued investment into the industry. There are a lot of factors that play into that. I'll just mention real quickly. What type of market are you in? Is it a major metropolitan market? Is it an outlying rural market? What tuition rate levels are there? What level of subsidy do you accept? How old is your real estate? How large is it? What level of gross revenues do you have? It really, there's so many factors that go into this that it's difficult to give those types of numbers without a pretty broad range. But it is a good question. And as you see those creep up even a quarter, you know, if you go a single site just goes from 4 to 4 1/4 as a multiple, it makes a big difference in the business value because, you know, let's say we've got $1 million company and they've got $150,000 cash flow on the bottom line, then whether that is multiplied by 4 or 4 1/4 makes a big difference. So it changes quickly, but good question. Let's see what we have here. Okay. There's my multiple. Owning real estate and business versus renting and business, what are the pros and cons? Which one have you guys seen works better in the long term? Yeah, really good question, and of course leads into exactly where we're going to be in 2017. First of all, personally, I'm a big fan of real estate ownership. I think that over time there can be blips on the radar in real estate values, but they really, in the long run, don't crash. And they're a lot less work than business assets because I've been there too. So I've been an operator and continue to be a real estate owner, and believe me, the rent check going in the bank is a lot easier. So over time, I'm a big fan of using real estate as a retirement asset. So as you position your company, I like the opportunity to put a tenant in your building, let them buy the business, and let you keep the real estate and use that as a retirement asset. Also, you can use your real estate as a growth asset. If you have one school or a couple of schools and you need the capital to grow into another one, you can either sell that real estate and swap it into a newer one. And the reason you would do that is that it's probably more profitable and would be seen more favorably than a new one. So, and then the other thing is you control your world when you own the real estate. You're responsible for everything. You're not going to be fighting with somebody to get maintenance done and worried about escalators and rent increases. So life's a lot easier when you own it. It's of course it's a distraction from growth too. At times we do have clients who want to put every bit of their excess cash into business growth, and that's okay too. I think people's strategies can be different. Personally, I like the stability of real estate ownership. But again, if I had the opportunity, and I will mention that because we have so many people wanting to grow, I will mention that you can make a growth plan, and you should be ready. But what you really have to do is be ready opportunistically, because you don't want to say, I'm going to grow by 3 schools this year and then go out and make 3 bad decisions because no good decisions came up. And then 5 good decisions may come up, and you need to find a way to act on that. So you need to have a plan, know what you might do, but then you just have to watch for the great opportunities when they come up. And owning real estate gives you some options and how you can use that asset to grow. So you'll hear more about that from us in 2017. Good question, so thanks for that. Let's see over here. Okay, in my area, the public schools offer pre-K and 4K programs for free or low cost. This seems like a good idea, but ends up being unfair competition. Parents used to willingly pay for all-day care for a 4-year-old. Now the school takes those children or pays my center to take them, but only for half the day and at reduced prices. How should we compete or adapt? I think a bit of that is the market that you're in. So this is happening everywhere. Most all states, it's really was funny to me to find out recently that there are still a few states that still don't have full-day 5-year kindergarten, because I remember when that hit most of our states about 20 years ago, and where 5-year-old kindergartens were in most child care centers, those really were gone very quickly. Because the public schools did a good job with that, and like you said, it was free. It did set up a different type of after-school experience, so you could participate in the after-school for those students, but you had to do it in a little bit different way since they were younger students. In most higher-end markets, parents will be willing to pay for a different type of experience in a private setting. If you can do something that distinguishes you from the more generic program that you might see in the public school. In some markets, parents are going to they're just going to gravitate toward the free program, and maybe they need to economically. And for you to have parents pay you if there isn't an actual or perceived difference in the program might be tough. I would consider some things that might be draws for parents that they won't get experienced in the public schools. I really love some of the dual language schools that are popping up across the country. There's some that focus on culture education, which is really exciting. I believe that there's a big movement in this parent base that recognizes that the U.S. has gotten a bit behind in how we expose children to different cultures and languages. So there's some preschools, and there are actually some public schools as well that offer dual language days. So they'll do a half day in English and a half day in a second language completely. So it's not just instruction, we change, and now we're only speaking Spanish, French, Mandarin, or the main ones are Spanish, French, Mandarin, and I want to say there's a fourth, but I'm not coming up with it. But anyway, so there's a good bit of that going on, and where the public schools, because of funding changes, have backed off of things like that. Mindfulness has gotten big in some markets where we're moving more toward a culture of yoga and meditation, and it's a specific market that works well in, but there are some. So I would just encourage something that really speaks to parents. It doesn't have to be splashy, but I think, unless you're in a market where parents really just struggle to pay for a full day, most of our clients can compete okay. It's going to hurt, but most clients can compete okay. Multiple site multiples. I think I hit that one okay with the multiples. If I didn't, please ask that question in a different way, because it, again, from the very lowest end to the very highest end, you would hit 3 with a troubled company, maybe even less, 4 with a single site that checks all the boxes, 5 to 7s for 10 to 20 site companies, and then the national groups are reportedly in the 10 to 12 multiple range. Will interest rates affect business value in real estate? Well, yes, of course. Again, there is some conversation. This remains to be seen. You notice I didn't predict it because I haven't seen a sign of it, but I think a couple of my brokers would disagree with me on this. That expected that interest rates will increase, and that we're in a bit of a sweet spot with real estate values especially. And that's logical. You know, as interest rates increase, we'll see less value, and the capitalizations rise, which decreases value and interest in real estate. I'm not sure that I see that big an impact on business values, but I'm certainly willing to entertain a different opinion from one of my guys out there if they have one. Did you give me? Okay. Any other questions, guys? We've got about 10 minutes. I'd love some words of wisdom. Anyone else seeing anything that we are not seeing that you'd like to comment on? Anything that I said that you think looks differently in your market? Love for everyone to learn from you guys. We got it, Carrie. Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. I appreciate it. You should get a short survey afterward. We would greatly appreciate you taking just a minute to give us some feedback on how this webinar went, what questions you might have, what other topics you would like to see. Please feel free to reach out and email directly if anything was unclear, or if you have a particular situation that you'd like to discuss that might be outside the norm of what we talked about here. It's a little bit hard to make this information generic because, as we said, there are just so many factors that play in. I'm optimistic and excited about our 2017. I think that we all have tremendous potential. I think that there's some interesting new things we can do and to create more value in our companies, and SSGA will be happy to be a part of that with you. Take care.